So welcome. I'm looking forward to having Lambert on board. And I will introduce him just briefly. He works as an independent consultant in the area of carbon markets, climate change, and energy policy. Has worked intensively, especially on the clean development mechanism and issues related to monitoring, reporting, verification, and accounting of greenhouse gas emissions overall. He studied energy, environmental, and chemical engineering at the Technical University of Berlin and has worked for a number of years at the Öko Institute until 2009. Interestingly enough, he's changed to the UNFCCC Secretariat in 2010 and led a team working on the development and improvement of methodologies. Since 2012, he's an independent consultant, also an associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute since 2013, and became a member of the CDM Executive Board. I couldn't imagine a better expert, and I actually have heard him talk on this topic to a small round of ecologic fellows here at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. I couldn't imagine a better expert to explain, the basics and dynamics now of the carbon markets after Paris. So welcome, Lambert. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to the event, and I'm very glad to be here. And maybe just one disclaimer, I of course talk on personal behalf, on my personal views, and not in any capacity as a board member, which Anne mentioned, which I'm also. So welcome. Let's move to the first slide. So I will mainly talk about the carbon market after Paris and give an overview. So there are two main carbon market instruments: emissions trading and crediting instruments. And this is an overview map from ICAP, which shows basically that there are a number of emission trading schemes already in place in Europe, in North America, in China, and some other countries. And there are many under consideration as well. So currently, I think it's about 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions which are subject to pricing, and that may raise to much more in the near term. Next slide, please. So I think the benefits of emissions trading are well known and objective, reducing cost and allowing through cost-effective mitigation to enhance ambition in the future. So I will focus here more on the challenges of emission trading systems. And I think really one issue which can be observed in many systems is the over-allocation of allowances. And that partially is because of the low ambition of targets, but partially also, of course, because of the uncertainty of future business as usual emissions. I think the EU ETS is a very good case where maybe initially the 2020 targets seemed ambitious, but then Europe had an economic recession and some other factors, and also very effective climate policies in some other areas, and emissions reduced much faster than anticipated, which then led to a big surplus of allowances and over-allocation of allowances. And basically it seems that most of the systems, even the new ones in China, face this type of challenge. And so as a response to that, some systems try to introduce policies to make market prices more predictable and more stable. And there are two large policies. One are quantity instruments, which are mainly considered by the EU ETS, the Market Stability Reserve, so to take units out of circulation or bring units back to circulation, depending on the number of units in which are over after which are available in the market. And there are other systems like price floors and possible ceilings, which can be observed, for example, in California, Quebec, and also though a low floor in RGGI in Northern America. Another big challenge of emission trading schemes is the linking. Linking is considered beneficial because it further improves cost effectiveness, but it requires a lot of harmonization of rules and of the ambition of the caps. And there are lots of concerns when linking of jurisdictions that they lose regulatory autonomy and have political uncertainty, and that there could be financial flows from one jurisdiction to the other and changes to the investment patterns, and that are a lot of barriers actually for linking. Next slide, please. So here a very brief overview on crediting mechanisms to date. So the clean development mechanism is the largest one, which with about 1.6 billion credits issued, followed by joint implementation, which had always much less attention, but which also issued nearly 900 million credits, and which has been a very large compliance instrument in Europe, but also in New Zealand, where a very large amount of units have been used for compliance. And then all the what is called voluntary standards, some of them can also be used for compliance, for example, in California, but they are often summarized at voluntary standard, the gold standard, the verified carbon standard, the climate action reserve, for example. They all together have issued about 300 million credits. Then there's a new mechanism, the joint crediting mechanism, that's a bilateral mechanism of Japan with other countries, and there has been no significant issuance up to date. Next slide, please. So what are the main challenges of crediting mechanisms? I think ensuring environmental integrity is the main challenge of crediting mechanism. Assessing additionality has been proven to be difficult, even if you use standardized approaches. It's not straightforward to assess whether a project would go ahead or not. Assessing baselines, it's very counterfactual, hypothetical. How would emissions develop in the absence? We had perverse incentives in some cases to extra produce greenhouse gas emissions, or to ensure that policies are not adopted in order not to lower the potential. And then another difficult issue is, of course, the overlap with other policies, like you have in many countries, for example, feed-in tariffs for renewable energy, and they overlap with crediting, and that also questions additionality. A general problem of crediting mechanisms, also compared to other policies like carbon taxes or ETS, is the information asymmetry. So the regulator does not have the same level of information as the regulated entities, and that's much more an issue for crediting mechanisms, where you need to assess additionality than for other policy instruments. And of course, there's always lots of uncertainty on all these questions, additionality, baselines, etc. So practically speaking, what is also a major challenge of mechanisms is the limited demand, which led to a price crash for CDM and JI credits. So the EU ETS originally imported a lot of credits, but there was a cap, and there's no credit import foreseen now as of 2020. And similarly, other schemes have limited use of crediting. China will probably allow some crediting, but only from domestic projects. South Korea, so far, also only from domestic projects. And California, Quebec is also importing some credits. Then there are, of course, some countries who use crediting for non-EU, non-ETS sectors, and that's also interesting. For example, Mexico and South Africa, they are considered carbon taxes, where you can meet some of the obligation of the carbon tax obligation with credits. And then credits are used for results-based finance, such as the pilot auctioning facility by the World Bank, where they auction rights, options to put carbon as a tool to deliver results-based finance. A larger demand source could possibly be ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is considering a market-based measure to offset greenhouse gas emissions from flights. And of course, there's always a voluntary market where people can offset their personal emissions, but that's also not very, very large. Other challenges, of course, of crediting mechanisms are the transaction costs and, for example, reaching dispersed sectors and less developed countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, here an example of one study which we published last year, where we assessed the environmental integrity of joint implementation and the difficulty with assessing additionality. And as you see on the right-hand side, our assessment was that the additionality, or the likelihood of additionality, was not plausible for 73% of the ERUs of the credits issued under joint implementation. And only for a fraction of 14% it was plausible. So we had a random sample of 60 projects which we assessed in detail. And most of the credits came from Russia and Ukraine, and these countries had so-called hot air, so they had an overhang in emission allowances and had little incentives to ensure environmental integrity. Next slide, please. So I will now give a quick, that was the general challenges of both main market-based approaches. So here, overview, it's a little bit complicated slide, but I hope it could also be useful to look at later on. It's the market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. So you have two main mechanisms. One is under Article 6.2, which is cooperative approaches, and one new mechanism under Article 6.4. And the main difference is under 6.2, it's a general mechanism to transfer mitigation outcomes, so to transfer some type of units or something similar between countries and to use them towards achieving the nationally determined contributions. Or here's a mistake, sorry. The governance of Article 6.2 is mainly by the parties, and it could be trading or crediting. And Article 6.4 is a little bit different because it establishes one mechanism which is similar to the CDM probably, because it is a crediting mechanism and the governance is under the UNFCCC, under UNFCCC body. There are some principles for robust accounting, and all these details of these mechanisms will have to laid out in further guidance by the CMA, so by the parties, or rules, modalities, and procedures. Next slide, please. So these accounting issues, I think, are quite interesting because there are a number of challenges ahead in the negotiations for the next years for the Paris agreements. So I think a first key challenge is that many mitigation pledges under the Paris Agreement, they are not necessarily expressed in absolute greenhouse gas emissions. They are sometimes relative targets, intensity targets, some are capacity of renewable energy. And so you would need, if you want to transfer units, you need to have the same matrix, and that's a challenge. So you have some sectoral non-GHG targets. Another challenge is that you also have conditional targets. So some countries have said, well, we will achieve this, but also this if we have additional support. And then the question is, what type of support is that? Is that carbon markets or climate finance? And how would that be accounted? And then a big challenge is that many targets are expressed as so-called single-year targets, so mostly 2030. So the countries say, okay, I will reduce my emissions by X% below business as usual in 2030. And if you quickly move to the next slide, I will come back to this slide afterwards. This is quite a challenge, and just to demonstrate. So here, assume you have 8 years, an 8 years period that could be also 10 years, and you reduce your emissions, and you would have an emissions budget in the left-hand side as under the Kyoto Protocol, and the yellow line are the business as usual emissions, and your emissions budget, which decreases year by year, is the dark blue area. So now if you want to use credits to fulfill your target, you have to buy credits for the amount of the wedge. So in each year of the 8-year period or 10-year period or whatever, you would need to buy some credits to make up the difference between your emissions and your target. So now if you have a single-year target, what you could do is that you only buy units in that single year. And otherwise, your emission trajectory could be the same. And so that would cumulatively would lead to higher emissions than if you have an emissions budget over several years. And so single-year targets, the idea of single-year targets are not really compatible with unit transfers. And so that's one of the big accounting challenges. Please go back to the last slide. Another challenge is double counting of emission reductions. That could take different forms. You could have double issuance, so that you issue 2 units for the same reductions. You could have double use, so that 1 unit is used twice. But you could also have double claiming, and that's if 1 unit appears in the GHG inventory of the host country, or not a unit, sorry, the reduction is reflected in the GHG inventory of the host country, and at the same time another party uses the units. And so that's also a tricky issue to address. Well, then the question is how to deal with units that lack environmental integrity. That's also a question in the negotiations to be solved. Will there be international rules to address units to avoid units that lack environmental integrity, or can parties just transfer whatever they want? And so a lot comes down to the governance arrangements, how much reporting, review, and compliance will be there, but also how much international rules will apply, or how much flexibility will be given to the national level, to the implementing agencies. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I think what we will probably see is a rather fragmented carbon market with a diversity of different ETS and different crediting mechanisms. We will have the UN mechanism under Article 6.4, but probably in parallel mechanisms like the joint mechanism by the Japan, so bilateral crediting mechanisms. It could also happen that we see some carbon clubs, and these carbon clubs could have different. One club could have a higher level of ambition and more strict standards, and a different club could have lower standards. And so that could possibly lead in carbon markets to different quality standards. I personally think we will have a more and more increasing role of ETS. This is what we observe on the ground. And if we have more role of ETS, it seems likely that we will have a decreasing role of crediting, because then the potential for crediting also decreases. You can see that in some JI countries which had ETS and ambitious targets, like Germany and France, where a limited number of JI projects were developed, partially because there are so many other policies in place, because there's an ETS, and there's just not so much potential for crediting. I think under the Paris Agreement, an interesting aspect is that probably more than 80% of global emissions will fall within the scope of INDCs, and that also changes the world. So we move from a CDM world more to a joint implementation world. The key question will be how much international oversight will we have on unit transfers, and probably there will not be a lot of oversight, but maybe some principles. And then a key question is whether the accounting rules, which will be finally concluded in the next years, whether they will be really robust and address issues like the single-year target issue. And finally, also a question by parties to look at is whether they want to address the quality of units and avoid trading of what's often called hot air, or whether their carbon clubs and hot air trade cannot be avoided. Yeah, thank you so much. That is the presentation. I have backup slides in case of specific questions, but that's for now the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lambert. That was some exciting insights, and thank you very much for this. As you might have seen on the camera, I was taking copious amount of notes, and of course have a number of questions. But I'll put them aside for the time being, and of course encourage discussion. So, Henning and Derek, if you're still online, Derek, I saw you coming back on and off again.
I am, sir.
Perfect. Wonderful. Wonderful. So if either of you, wants to start off with a question, Henning is nodding. So
sure, absolutely. I mean, I have so many questions. I don't even know where to start. I would just try to limit myself to 2, if I may.
Please go ahead.
Oh, could you maybe switch off your microphone again?
Of course.
Again, the echo. Thanks. So the first one is about this international oversight that you mentioned. The way I understand or understood the internationally transferable mitigation outcome so far is that countries define their targets usually in relation to a business as usual scenario, and if they outperform those targets, then they could in theory transfer the difference between their target and what they actually emitted as mitigation outcomes. Now, will there be any review or plausibility check on these targets and on the BAU scenarios, because they will be one integral part of the amounts of ITMOs that can be transferred? And then the second question is more general on emission trading systems. I've spent my whole career in emission trading, so in theory I'm a big fan of emission trading. Now, with the experience of the European emission trading scheme and the early experience now with the Chinese schemes, it seems so complex to actually predict future business as usual scenarios, and then based on that adjust the amount of allowances that you issue to emitters. Now, what mechanism actually could come in place or could be installed by the various schemes to account for that and make the system flexible enough to either adjust or backload credits, to not either create an excessive supply or an undersupply of credits, without imposing very strict pricing corridors that in the end would result in something that looks like a tax but has the complexity of an emission trading system, which doesn't really or it combines the negative effects of both.
Okay, two interesting questions, Lambert.
Yep. So I think the targets itself, I mean, they are sometimes derived from business as usual emissions, and I think there will be transparency requirements in terms of that parties determine how they estimate their business as usual emissions, and they will probably need to report on that, and there will be probably some type of transparency process. But I think my understanding that it's clearly up to the parties to make their pledge, and so I don't think that there will be international rules which will say your business as usual emissions, like a compliance committee, which would say your business as usual emissions were wrong, and this is the correct number. I mean, also the compliance mechanism, which is under Article 15, I think, is more of it says non-punitive and facilitative manner. So I don't expect much on that guidance, but what I expect is that there will be international rules for the transfer of units. So you have a clear request for guidance under Article 6.2 that any international transfers should promote integrity, avoid double accounting, etc., and that parties should develop guidance towards that end. So I think this guidance will include elements that, for example, controls that only what you said, that if you overachieve your target, you can only sell the overachievement, or that in the end there's a net balance which ensures that there's no double counting, double claiming. Hopefully, that will be in place. Yeah, and the ETS question, that's a really interesting one. I mean, I also don't have the answer, and I think this is really debated by policymakers across the world. I find now the actual debate in Europe quite interesting. You're probably aware, or you have heard, that France has proposed a price floor and has also announced that, as the UK, it may even impose a national price floor. They have announced recently, and I personally think price floors are a good way to ensure that there's a minimum incentive for business to mitigate. I think price ceilings are a much more difficult and critical debate, of course, and I think still an ETS would have the advantage with price floors and price ceilings. It gets a little bit like a carbon tax, because, as you say, right, there's a range. But I think a key advantage is that an ETS is more flexible to address carbon leakage, because you can do free allocation to industries which are vulnerable to carbon leakage. And the advantage compared to a tax is that they are still exposed to the carbon price, because it's an opportunity cost. So they still have the same incentive to reduce their emissions, but they don't have net costs if they get sufficient allowances, or only small costs. While if they would have a tax, the tax would apply to the full amount of emissions, and then they would have a much stronger competitive disadvantage compared to when you have ETS with floor or ceiling prices, which is a similar mechanism like a carbon tax in the end.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. Derek, do you have a question as well? Otherwise, I'll jump in.
Yes, sorry.
No, go ahead, yeah.
Am I echo?
Yeah, you go ahead. I'm muting myself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm less of an expert here, especially on carbon markets, but what we're looking at here in Washington is kind of where we're going towards carbon taxing or trading. I'm wondering from kind of the global perspective, you mentioned that linkage would be quite complicated with what was laid out here, but what do you see kind of how the subnational players link in potentially or not?
Maybe you're more expert on this than I am. I think there are some linkages in the United States, and more are being considered. So maybe that is a more promising route. But I also heard in debates on linking, I often heard jurisdictions expressing concerns that it could lead to financial flows to other jurisdictions. For example, if one jurisdiction adopts a very ambitious target, right, and it links with a jurisdiction which has a less ambitious target, it will basically lead to financial flows from the higher price jurisdiction to the lower price jurisdiction. And so so there could be concerns that the investment patterns change and that you give money away, etc. And I think these are some political barriers. So I think if, for example, Quebec and California, my understanding is their systems were set up initially pretty similar, really with a view to link later on. And so the rules were harmonized, and they have a similar ambition, etc. And so then, of course, linking is much easier, and that probably often applies to subnational schemes. So I'm also curious if you have more insights. I heard that probably under the Clean Power Act that there would be much more linking from states. And for example, RGGI, I heard, has also a hearing now for the conditions of other states to link to RGGI.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much more than you. I know there's some resistance. Washington right now, they're looking at some executive action that would create a kind of an awkward capping scheme on individual entities, so not an aggregate cap, but then Washington entities would be able to purchase from California and RGGI, and I know those two jurisdictions have been resistant. It sounds like from you that there's just on the international level there is a lot of concern and resistance to linking, and for the reasons you outlined. So that was kind of what I was wanting to get at a little bit, that it seems rather unlikely at this point.
I think maybe one more aspect is there could be some. We also wrote a paper on that. There could be some options of restricted linking, that you, for example, you have quotas or discount rates to other systems. That could be a possibility, but that has also limitations, because then you don't have full fungibility. And I think for many smaller jurisdictions, it's really attractive to link. For example, from the European experience, Switzerland, I think they have about 50 ETS installations. And so that's just too small to have a real market, a real working market. So you need much more liquidity. And that was the main reason why Switzerland and Norway, they definitely wanted to link and join the EU ETS. So probably it also depends a lot on the size. So to really have a functional market, in particular if you want to trade units at exchanges, you need a much larger liquidity.
Thank you.
Great. So I would like to follow up on this question that you guys just brought up as well, because I think, Lambert, maybe I would be really interested to know. I've been following ETS globally mostly until 2014, 15, and it's not only volatile markets but also volatile political developments. So like only 2 or 3 years ago, Switzerland wanted to join the EU ETS. Then we had Korea and China just starting regional schemes. We still had developments in Australia regarding emission trading system, then carbon tax, then abolishing that again, and going back and forth in a number of systems. So I would be interested to know, do you have any examples of actually cross-border ETS linking that's sort of already running? Because all the examples I have in my head is things like the Western Climate Initiative starting off as a much larger project than it is now, among provinces and in Canada and California. So things have been really not always on the upside of things. Do you have an example in mind that really is working already, or do we have any best practices that we could use already, or are we still trying to figure out on the global level what actually needs to be done to make this work?
I mean, you could, if you look to the history of the EU ETS, you could say, I would now say it's one system, so it's not a linked independent, because you have one cap for the whole EU ETS and you have exactly the same benchmarks, etc. So it's really one system and no linking. But in the first, in the second period, in the first period, it was actually more linking, because it was national states setting targets, which were reviewed by the Commission, but they were proposed and set independently, and they had also different allocation rules. And so maybe the EU ETS is a little bit a history where linking led to really a joint system with a joint cap and the rules. And yeah, I mean, California kept it in theory. It's a cross-country system. I mean, it's not on national level, but it's Canada and the United States. And what I found interesting is that basically, I mean, the United States, I think they said in the submission, for the time being, they are not engaging in international transfers or something like that. What's written in their communication to the UNFCCC. But if there would be a lot of trade between Canada and the United States, they would need to capture that somehow in their NDC achievement. Otherwise, one of the countries would run into trouble. And then, of course, I mean, the only other example I'm aware is, of course, there were considerations of linking Australia and the EU ETS. And what we have is the links to Norway and Switzerland. I'm not aware of anything else.
Okay, so I'm happy I followed those discussions, but I agree to some extent that the previous EU ETS periods were more of a linking approach, and that would actually bring me to a second question of mine. You were mentioning that regarding the price floor in the EU ETS, and that the ETS would still have the benefit of covering or enabling at least the regulator to hand out free allowances to combat carbon leakage. And just from my memory, in the first periods of the EU ETS, at least, there was, of course, the large majority of allowances given away for free. This grandfathering approach that was being taken, especially in the first period, actually caused the biggest problems and the oversupply in the first place. So do you think that, to which extent do you think it's that the sort of carbon leakage argument is still a valid one to make? Is this really an issue? That would be the first part of my question. And the second one would be, would those in a new role or EU system, would those cause any state aid troubles, or don't they? If they come from the EU specifically, that would be just rule out any competition problems on the EU level and only cause maybe some on the WTO level.
It's a really good question. I think, now in the electricity sector, with few exceptions, there's generally auctioning of allowances and no free allocation in the third phase and thereafter. So that's already a very large proportion of units which are actually auctioned. And I think the current rules in the EU ETS, they are too, how to say, too generous. I mean, they give a lot of free allocation to many industries, and some of them are not so exposed to carbon leakage. So the list is very exhaustive, let's say it like that. And then what was interesting, if you look to the previous years, what you see is that the number of allowances some industry got is much larger than their actual emissions. So they are net sellers, and so they actually earn money with the ETS. So they don't face a cost, but they make profit, because the value of the allowances they can sell is much larger than any cost that they have. And so actually one could say that the EU is subsidizing indirectly some of its industries through being very generous in the allocation of allowances, and therefore giving them a competitive advantage compared to maybe some other countries. That's, in my view, in the current situation, would be a valid argument. But if you would allocate a little bit less stringently and maybe reconsider which industries, I think in principle the instrument of saying, okay, if some industries, and there are some which are really exposed to the risk of carbon leakage, in particular if you would assume higher prices. I mean, now we have 5-6 euro, but if you would assume 30 or 40 euro, what people may expect after 2030, then the risk of carbon leakage, of course, gets higher. And in some industries, it is a real risk. And then allocating for free allowances to those industries to a certain level, of course, I think is an appropriate instrument to address this risk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Henning and Derek, you have other questions in mind?
Sure.
I also have a couple on my list, so but please go ahead, Henning. Go ahead.
Maybe coming back to this international cooperation under the Paris Agreement, you mentioned that we are probably moving from a CDM-like regime towards a JI-like regime, and I believe you're referring to accounting actually emission reductions on both sides. So one country gets the emission reduction, the other one has to account for the emissions. Could you elaborate a bit how that might work?
The difference is that under the Kyoto Protocol, we had many countries who did not have any target, right? All the CDM countries, so there was a large uncapped environment. And now we are in a situation where most countries have economy-wide targets. Though there are significant targets, I pointed out that difficulty. And so that's the main reason the NDCs why we are moving to a JI world. And so there are a number of accounting provisions in the Paris Agreement. And under Article 6.2, international transfers, and in another paragraph of the Paris Agreement, which is 37, it basically says that you should have adjustment to greenhouse gas inventory to address double count. So it says so you should adjust greenhouse gas inventories. In my understanding would be that this would imply that countries who export units would add the units to the reported emissions, and countries who import units can subtract them from their reported emissions. And if you go one slide further, I think, yeah, and here it shows a little bit. So if one country, let's say it has emissions of 100 megatons and then reduces by 10, so it results up with 90, and it exports these emissions to another country, so this other country can emit 10 more, then the key accounting issue is that one country adds and one country subtracts, and if that doesn't happen, you have this double claiming, which is called double claiming. So if the party on the left side does not account for export, but party B does account for the import, then you have a declared total of 190 megatons, but the combined emissions of the inventories are 200. And so you lose something, and you emit more to the atmosphere than what you report for your pledge achievement. And that's the issue, which is called double claiming, which is controversially being discussed. But I think my reading, we will need to see now the negotiations, but my reading of the Paris Agreement is that it's very clear that you have to do these adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Will there be an overlooking body who registers all these transfers, or will that have to be done by the countries themselves in whatever 5-year review cycle?
That's a very good and open question. I don't know. I mean, this is really up to the parties. There's no such body. I mean, there's the compliance committee foreseen. That's a general body overseeing the transparency framework, but there's no body foreseen under the Paris Agreement for transfers under Article 6.2, which is this cooperative approaches. But of course, some type of mechanism or oversight or control by whomever. There are many different implementation options. It's really speculation.
Yeah.
Okay, let me follow up this row of questions on the new parent mechanism, because you mentioned the different ideas behind Article 6.2 and 6.4 in the Paris Agreement, and you mentioned also, one would be member state driven 6.2 and the other one UNFCCC driven, right? Yeah. So I was wondering, because just from reading the text, and obviously that's sometimes only half a quarter of the knowledge, but just from reading the text, it doesn't say or even use the word crediting, right? So because you were mentioning that the mechanism under 6.2 could actually be an ETS or crediting mechanism, and the one at 6.4 would be most likely, I don't know, or definitely a crediting mechanism. That's something to be taken from the Paris negotiations, or is that something that's common knowledge in the negotiating stream, or is it just open for discussion and interpretation?
No, I mean nothing is decided yet, so it's all interpretation and discussion. Maybe the background. I mean, Article 6.4. The relevant paragraphs in the COP decision to the Paris Agreement, they talk about elements like emission reductions, additionality, these type of principles which only apply to crediting. And so that's, let's say, that's the legal text point where my personal interpretation is that it is a crediting mechanism. The other issue is that the text there were a lot of small groups in Paris, and this text was drafted by a small group, which, to my knowledge, also included Brazil and EU negotiators, and the understanding, or those involved, I think they wanted something like a new CDM type mechanism. And so that was kind of, therefore, if you look to the language, it really has a lot of CDM elements. It even talks about designated operational entities, the auditors, so it uses the same term. A lot of the participation of public and private entities is there. So a lot of elements which is CDM language are there. And given that in the negotiation history, it seems, it seems perceivable that it's a crediting mechanism. But of course, parties can come with different interpretations, and all that is not decided. And under Article 6.2, I think the language of internationally transferable mitigation outcomes is very general, and it doesn't refer to what it is. So presumably it would be relatively open, and it's already clear from some parties like Japan that they intend to use that mechanism, for example, for the joint crediting mechanism. And so that's an interpretation from context, but of course nothing is decided.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I agree that it reads into this direction. So I'm really curious to see what happens in Bonn and then the next COP 22 as well. And but just from this, taking it from the point there, might be interest, especially in the EU and Brazil, to have this sort of CDM type mechanism, to use credit in the future. You also mentioned there wouldn't be, at least in the EU ETS, not a specific need for credits at least until 2020. So do you think, or where do you think the market stability reserve will be going? Will it really be just a temporary taking out allowances out of the market, to actually create some more demand, or will it actually be some sort of set aside at some point and just trying to get rid of this horrible over allocation at some point?
Yeah, that I do not really dare an answer to that. I mean, this is really looking in the uncertainty of politics. I think, I mean, more speaking from what is necessary, I think it would be really necessary to moving out permanently quite a large number of units to make the market really work. And I personally think, I mean, we did this JI study last year, which really showed that JI really did not work. I mean, there are some good JI projects which really worked and which were really successful and which have high environmental integrity. But there were a lot of credits from Russia and Ukraine which really have very low integrity, and we found very creative rules also to overestimate emission reductions. And many projects which were registered in 2012, for example, but started operation in 2002, but never tried to achieve JI status before, so where additionality is clearly not given. And many of these credits were used in the EU ETS. And so one could argue that it undermined indirectly the emissions effect of the EU ETS. And I think that could be a strong argument to say, okay, we allowed for these imports, but it didn't work from an environmental perspective. And so to compensate for that, we would need to take out some other units permanently and make the target more strictly. So there's an argument of price and market overhang, but there's also an environmental integrity argument to do so.
Great, thank you. With the view to the timing, Henning, do you have another question? I think there's time for one more.
I do have one. It's not a really technical question though. In Paris there was an atmosphere of enthusiasm somehow. So you know, this high ambition coalition, and throughout the 2 weeks it seemed much more than the previous COPs that parties were really positive. How do you see that, or how has it developed since Paris? Do you see it's still this feeling of enthusiasm in the air, or do people now get sober again and see the conflicts arising again?
That's also a difficult question. I mean, I'm not following the negotiations so closely, or I'm not in direct contact and dialogue, so that I could really say, and we would need to see. But having been for many years following the negotiations more closely, what I sometimes saw is that when there was an agreement, that afterwards the first negotiation round was quite difficult, because people kind of went beyond their comfort zone when agreeing, and then when they meet again, they try to make claims and interpretations and try to maybe get back the points which were not reflected in the agreement, and try to make them again, etc. But I mean, maybe I'm too pessimistic. So maybe the mood of Paris, and I think it was a really good step. So it's really much better than anything we have seen the last 15 years. Although clearly it's not sufficient what we have on the table. But maybe the mood will also be better, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I think I would call it a day for today. Thank you so much, Lambert, for your time and exquisite participation in the discussion. I think especially for even with a small group as this, we really have some could tackle some issues and talk about quite a lot of things. So thank you very much for that. I can only encourage our viewers, the ones who can't join us right now but might watch this later on YouTube, to subscribe to our channel, because we're planning to upload more discussions like this in the future and continue the discussions. So please subscribe and feel free to get in touch with us via the Ecologic website, ecologic.eu, and the ELEEP network on Facebook and of course on YouTube. Thank you very much, and we're offline. Thank you.